Competition happens most often between what kind of species? Related. And if you sort of extend this to the metaphor of competing with your siblings over stuff versus competing with your cousins, who do you compete with more, your siblings or your cousins? Oh, yeah. Because you're closely related. You're side by side, you're elbow to elbow, you're nose to nose. You know, if you want that last piece of cake in the fridge, it's down to you two. Your cousins, you don't compete with as closely. You don't have all the same resource needs in terms of parental affection or household space or cake in the fridge. So you do tend to compete more closely with species that are more closely related to you. And that's kind of the piece that had come up in the other class that I wanted to expand on. Okay, so what I wanted to expand on was this idea of close relationships. And I wanted to talk a little bit about biological relatedness. We sort of talked about this when we talked about evolution, but I wanted to expand it because the question that came up in the other class was based on the piece we listened to about the Galapagos Islands and those little finches. And somebody said, well, you know, if they're all finches, aren't they just the same species? So does interbreeding really make a difference? And, you know, when we said species are things that can't interbreed or don't interbreed, I just don't get it. I want more information, which is a good question. And so we're going to expand this idea of closely related species. And what I want to look at with you is the following thing. So we haven't really done like levels of biological classification for your species. And I'm going to use the coyote as an example, even though I have one. Oh, this is good. I have one coyote and I have one fox in here. So we're going to use those as sort of an example. And you may remember looking up your species' biological name, yes? Okay. Do you remember what your species' biological name was without looking? It's okay if you don't. It's fine. It's vulpus vulpus. You've got Ursus americanus. Nope, can't do it. Odocoilus virginianus. Anyway, all biological species have this two-part name. So just like you have, in our culture, we commonly use two-part names. And those two parts are made up of a genus and a species. So when we refer to coyote, who is Canis latrans, Canis is the genus, latrans is the species. Okay? So that's how we get that two-part name. With the little finches, those would all probably be in the same genus, but they would be different species. The more levels of classification something shares, the more closely related they are. So when I was in college, because I remember I majored in biology, the thing that we always remembered was King David came over for great spaghetti. Not King David, King Philip. David is in botany. And that's kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and then it's genus, species. So King Philip came over for great spaghetti, or green salad, or whatever you're into. Well, so we know that we said the coyote is Canis latrans. I'm going to write their common name down there. Well, let's look at the wolf. Because remember, we talked a little bit about how wolves and coyotes sometimes compete, like out west where they exist in the same areas, where they're in the same ecosystems. They compete for resources to some degree. But coyotes are super flexible. They're really adaptable. And so they They're more generalist than wolves are, so they kind of adapt their niche so that they're not competing head-to-head with wolves, because me versus a wolf, coyote versus a wolf, wolf wins. Well, wolves are also in the genus Canis. They are Canis lupus. Okay? There's one more species that you're familiar with in this same genus. You've probably all given them treats or baths or walks. Yeah, domestic dogs are Canis familiaris. You don't have to write that down. But they're in the same genus as wolves and coyotes. And even though these things are different species, they can still interbreed. They typically do not. In areas where coyotes and wolves, where you've got full-fledged populations of both of them out west, like in Yellowstone, a male coyote that wanders into a bunch of female wolves is not going to get lucky. He's going to get killed. Like, no babies are coming out of that. And a male wolf who wanders up to some female coyotes is probably also not going to mate with her. He's going to kill her. So it's not, there's no romance here. Now, we said the eastern coyote, the coyote we have back here, was a cross between wolves and coyotes. But wait. We said they're different species. They don't interbreed. And the biologist on the Galapagos piece, and I really like that she pointed this out, she said, even for species that are capable of interbreeding, sort of the classical definition of species means they don't. Wolves and coyotes can produce offspring. They can actually even produce fertile offspring. But they typically don't for a lot of reasons. They are different species. We don't see hybridization. If we look at sort of the rest of this chart for these guys, the family these guys belong to, so actually here's how we can illustrate this. We can cut this out. We can say that these are both in the genus Canis. Well, they're both in the family. Whoops. Canidae. It sounds a lot like Canis, doesn't it? It's the dog family. Canidae is the larger dog family. They are both in the order Carnivora. What does that sound like? Carnivores. And they're in the order Carnivora along with lions and tigers and bears and other things that are our big predator meat eaters, but that are not dog-like. And they are all in the class Mammalia. What does that sound like? Mammals. All things that nurse their young. So this would include, bears and cats and coyotes and badgers and dolphins and humans and a whole lot of other mammals. And all of these mammals are in the phylum Vertebrata. What does that sound like? Vertebrate. Take your hand, put it on the back of your neck. Do you have a backbone? If you do not, I will get you medical attention promptly. You're a vertebrate. So is a fish. So is a bird. So is a snake. So is a frog. So is a coyote. So is a dog. And all of these things are in the kingdom Animalia. So this includes insects and, gosh, what's the most unrelated to us kind of animal I can think of? Octopuses and sea cucumbers and earthworms. They're not very closely related. They only share one category with us. So most of your competition is going to happen between species that share most of these categories. The more levels of classification you share, the more closely related you are. So now let's talk about our little red friends. Gabby. Our foxes, our little foxes, our foxy little friends. So foxes share with coyotes and wolves all of these categories. Foxes are animals, vertebrates, mammals, carnivores, and they're in the family Canidae, but they're not in the genus Canis. Red foxes are vulpus. I made that too big. Vulpus. So they're not as closely related. And hey, guess what? Red foxes and wolves don't have nearly the niche overlap that wolves and coyotes do. So the more closely related two species are, the more they tend to compete. And the question that had come up that kind of prompted this was, what about that interbreeding thing? So when we think about, let's use the example of wolves and coyotes who are in the same genus. And I think this is so amazing. You don't have to copy down all the details on this. I'm going to flip to a new slide because I want to pull up a map. So if you remember, we said when the first Europeans arrived here, this was all wolf country. The entire eastern U.S. was wolf country. This was the territory of the wolf. And coyotes, actually, no, you know what, that's wrong, because wolves would have existed. Actually, probably all of that was wolf territory, really. And coyotes would have had, and I did not mean to leave out California, because wolves would have been there too, but coyotes would have existed more in a range like this. So coyotes were very much sort of a western thing and largely a southwestern thing. There were no coyotes in Ohio in 1803. You know this from your research, and we've talked about it. And wolves existed in probably all of North America and up into Canada, down into Mexico. There's what's called the Mexican red wolf. Well, what happened to the wolves? So let's talk first about why there were no coyotes over here. Coyotes, and if you ever get a chance in your life to go out west, go camping someplace in Arizona or Texas or Oklahoma or the prairies of Colorado, and hopefully get a glimpse of wolves or of coyotes, because western coyotes are a whole different thing. They're these little skinny knee-high dogs. They're cool, and they're very much animals of deserts and grasslands. They are not a forest creature. They are just not a forest animal. Wolves were very much, there were a lot of subspecies of wolves, but wolves were forest creatures. They also lived on the plains. They also lived on the prairies. They were pretty adaptable in that regard, but coyotes were distinctly not a forest creature. Well, what happened to the wolves in the eastern U.S.? Actually, most of the U.S. What happened? There was some kind of ecological pressure on them. What was the ecological pressure? Us. We killed them all. Hung them on barbed wire fences, and it was pretty ugly business. So wolves were wiped out, except for some little populations of wolves that continued to live up in the northern U.S. Okay? So like the UP of Michigan, northern Minnesota, there were existing wolf populations. And we also changed the landscape really significantly, especially in the eastern U.S. So remember we said when the first European settlers got here, this was all big forests. There weren't a whole lot of clearings. It was big, dark trees, no grassland. What did we do? Cut them all down. We made it into farmland and pastures. And that was a lot more like what coyotes were accustomed to. And so what you start to see is that coyotes start to extend their range. And as coyotes get up into this area where they're mixing with little tiny wolf populations, you start to have individual coyotes and wolves, because now they're both under ecological pressure for different reasons, who instead of killing one another, mate and have offspring, and those offspring survive. And so what we have, so this is western coyote territory. What we end up with is this new thing, which is eastern coyotes. That's really hard to read. I apologize. And that eastern coyote, so how many of you have stood next to a big German Shepherd? Okay, nice thigh-high German Shepherd, dog whose back comes almost up to your hip. Pretty big dog. How many of you have stood next to a dog who just comes up to your knee? Skinny little dogs. Okay. The western coyote is that skinny little knee-high dog, that little 30-pound dog. The eastern coyote is that 70-pound, nearly comes up to your hip, kind of German Shepherd. Still not as big as a wolf, but much, much bigger than the western coyote. And really it's a different species. Now, could they interbreed? Sure. I mean, they've got a lot of the same DNA. They could. They typically don't. So, when do species cross species boundaries to breed? You know that, have you ever heard someone rejected for a date with the expression, if you were the last man on earth? You've heard this? That's kind of what it comes down to for species under pressure. So, for these wolves up here in the northern U.S., and for these coyotes who are going into a new place, who kind of don't know anything and are expanding their range, it's kind of like, well, if you were the last canid on, oh heck, you might as well be. For these birds in the Galapagos who are suddenly breeding across species boundaries, if you were the last bird on, oh gosh, you might be, okay. They're under real ecological pressure, and that's when we start to tend to see those kind of things. And ecological pressure can happen for a lot of reasons. Natural, human-caused, the parasite that's currently, parasite-caused, though if you back that one up, it's human-caused, because those parasites probably didn't arrive on the island themselves. But that's, so the thing I wanted you to get was this idea of relation, and this idea of when does that kind of thing happen? Only when it's pretty catastrophic. Okay, let's talk about competition. Resource partitioning is just this idea that, in essence, siblings can put a masking tape line down the middle of the bedroom. Species can kind of do the same thing. So when you've got closely related species living side by side, but remember, their whole goal, stay alive, make babies. Make sure your babies stay alive. Well, if you can't get enough food, if you can't get enough shelter, then you're going to fail on your primary objective. Stay alive to make babies and make sure your babies stay alive. Okay. Sometimes, if you're a little bit flexible, if you're a little bit of a generalist, you can adapt what you're doing and use only part of a resource. So this, and I didn't realize how classic this study was. This was done in the 50s. I know, and this also was mentioned in the other class when they talked about, all these finches. How different do these birds look to you? Really look at them. It's just colors. Look at their beaks. Their beaks are very similar. Look at the shape of their head. The shape of their head is very similar. Look at their tail. Their tail is very similar. These are all birds that would fit neatly in the cupped palm of your hand. They're tiny little birds. Other than their color patterns, they aren't all that different. They have, relatively recent common ancestors. They're pretty closely related. They're all warblers, and they all eat bugs, and they all live in pine forests during their nesting season. Pretty similar. And they all eat the same kinds of bugs. So it was thought, remember he mentioned this in the crash course, it was thought that they were just an exception to competition, that they just didn't compete with one another. And what, I can't remember the biologist's name now, found out when he really, really watched them carefully is that no. So here's your Cape May warbler, and Cape May warblers only feed at the top on the outside branches. And here's your yellow-rumped warbler, and they feed only at the bottom there. And here is your black-throated green, and they feed only in the middle on the outsides. And here is your Blackburnian, and they feed only on the very outsides in the middle. And then here's your little bay-breasted, and they feed in the middle up near the trunk and in the middle of the tree to the outsides. That's crazy. I mean, it's like duct tape lines going around the tree, and it's not that formal. But they, you know, how does a bird learn where to find food? Their parents teach them. Their parents show them how to forage. Where do their parents show them where to forage? Where their parents foraged. And so you have this pattern that gets passed on, and what it does is it allows 5 species that are really closely related that need really similar things to all live there and all survive. And everybody gets some of what they need. You know, would the bay-breasteds be happier if they could hunt all over the whole tree? Maybe. More calories, bigger bay-breasted population. But it's a way of sharing. So I'm going to cut you loose to do research. You should be working on predation, or predator-prey, parasite, and apparently I have been informed I didn't put competition on there. Oops, I meant to. So go ahead and start working on commensal and mutualistic. You can look at the notes, and we've kind of talked about what those are. For commensal, you'll want to listen to this, because commensal is so hard to find. There are so few genuine, documented, well-understood commensal relationships. I will give you 1 bonus point if you can find one commensal relationship with good enough documentation that, like, sources agree, oh yeah, that is a commensal relationship. Because remember, commensal is where one species benefits and the other one is like, meh, it doesn't hurt them. Okay? So I'll turn you loose. Off you go.